Partridge here. And today I thought I'd do another little video talking about musical composition techniques, in particular ones that I used writing a piece of mine called Canon and Fugue in G minor. The fugue portion of this piece I wrote when I was a teenager, and it's actually the earliest composition of mine that I still perform. The canon portion was written about 4 years later, specifically to go with the fugue. So what does it mean when I say that something is a canon? This is the sort of thing that's a lot easier to demonstrate than to describe in words. So here we go. The piece starts off like this. Okay? Now notice that that's what we would call one voice. It's a single melodic line. It could have been played by a violin or sung by a singer. Now, 4 measures into the piece, a second voice enters, and here's what it plays. You may notice that that sounds exactly like what the first voice did. And in fact, they are note for note the same melody, except that the second voice is singing an octave lower. So, this is what makes it a canon. We can express this in a rule. We can say each voice that comes in the piece begins 4 measures after the voice that came before it, and it plays the exact same melody that the voice before it played, only an octave lower. So when the third voice comes in, we should be able to predict how it's going to sound, and in fact it does, like this. Exactly the same thing. Now, of course, while the successive voices are coming in, the previous voices are continuing to go. And each voice must follow what its previous voice did note for note. As a composer, that's where the challenge lies, right? How do I make this thing, it's like a puzzle, so that each piece fits together? But above and beyond that, how do I make it a beautiful piece of music? Because you could write a computer program that could write a canon that would not violate any rules of music, but it wouldn't be any interesting to hear. So, I won't go into the details, but in this canon, I start introducing more and more chromaticism, which means notes that are outside of the normal scale. This is in G minor. So we have a portion, for instance, that goes something like this. A lot of little chromatic notes. Okay? So, that's what makes the first part a canon. All right, so now we're ready to talk about the fugue. This is what's called a two-voice fugue. So the canon we had 3 voices. The fugue only has 2 voices. And like a canon, it starts off with 1 voice, and then a second voice joins it. The second voice joins it. And like the canon, what the second voice plays is very similar to what the first voice played. In a strict canon, it has to be exactly note for note what the first voice played. In a fugue, it doesn't have to be that exact. Traditionally, in a fugue, the second voice comes in either a 5th higher or a 4th lower than the first voice. In this case, we're a 4th lower. And it plays something very similar to what the first voice played. So the first voice here goes. Second voice goes. contour, there's some little slight shifts harmonically. But after we've stated those two voices, then we're really free, we as a composer are really free to do whatever we like. The word fugue means flight. And so it was supposed to be the chance for the composer to do something imaginative with this stuff. And so I do a bunch of different things with it. But the thing that I'm going to use is the fact that I've established that little melody so that when it comes back in again, your ear will pick it up and recognize it. So that's what a fugue is. There's two little technical things I wanted to talk about in this fugue because they're very important in the composition of it. And the first one is the idea of a static line versus a moving line. So in this fugue subject, we've got a part that stays the same and a part that moves. Listen to how it goes together. So you hear that the moving part is being contrasted with this repeated part. And it is the tension that's created between the static part that keeps anchoring us on this pitch and the moving part which keeps pulling us away from it that creates the tension in this piece. There's a point here that is very important to people playing pieces like this. A common mistake is for the performer to go, well, that little part doesn't move, it's kind of not very interesting, so I'm going to bring out the moving part. But then you lose all that tension, right? It's that static part has to insist on itself to be able to create a balance against the moving part. So it should be played like this. Okay? So, you'll hear in this fugue, the static part really, really gets repeated over and over and over again, these repeated notes. Sometimes it's on a G, a lot of times it's on a D, which is the dominant, the fifth degree of the scale. Sometimes it's on other notes as well. So, but that constant reiteration of that note, da, 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 as a counterbalance to the moving part is a really important compositional technique in this. And the other thing that is related to that is that the piece was written for organ, although nowadays I usually perform it on the piano. But the organ has this really great quality that you can strike a note and it will keep going at the same degree of loudness. So on the piano, the minute I hit that note, it starts to get quieter, right? Fading away. But on the organ, let me zip out of screen here for a second. On the organ, as long as I hold that note, it stays the same volume. And that gives us the ability to do some really neat stuff. At the end of this fugue, there's that note. If I were playing the organ, I would be pressing with my foot on the pedal to hit that low note. And it would just roar out for as long as I held it down. And we call that pedal point because it is played by the pedals on the organ. Now, if you do the same thing up here, on the organ, you get the same effect of that long held out note. It's going to be really a gorgeous effect if it's used intelligently. We call it organ point if it is up in an upper voice. Okay, at the end of this fugue, you'll hear I use the pedal point and then it jumps up an octave and then it jumps up an octave, so now it's organ point. And in fact, one of the few places, at least in my compositions, where the hands don't cross, they in fact interlock. this left hand has got to play a note in between the fingers of the right hand. Okay. Lots of fun. All right, so now we've talked about that. The final piece of compositional trivia that I wanted to give you is the very end of this piece. After that long, big pedal point and the organ point with this big crashy thing. That switch at the end from minor to major is convention in music is called the tierce de Picardy, and Bach uses it all the time, Haydn, Handel, all those guys use it a lot. So much so, in fact, that it's kind of become a musical cliche. And so as a composer, you don't want to use it too often because it is a cliche. But in this particular case, I really felt that the piece demanded it because it's kind of a bravura piece with a lot of energy, and then we come to this big triumphant end, and the raising up from minor to major gives it a real triumphal kind of sound to it. Okay, I'm going to stop the tape, and then I'm going to start again, and I'm going to play the Canon and Fugue in G minor.